And that's why it's important to call these detention centers what they are. For many people, the term concentration camp is too emotionally charged. But if we don't call these detention centers concentration camps, then we haven't learned anything useful from the history of concentration camps.
Now, I thought leftists were supposed to be the progressive party. They were supposed to have big-brained ideas about taking our country in a new direction in the future. I always thought of the conservative party as being the side that was rooted in the past and adhered to tradition. Yet these days it seems like every time a leftist opens their mouth, they want to talk about something that happened nearly a century ago, if not longer. Now, I really didn't want to have to do another video on the Holocaust. I just made a response to Loose Change, or whatever the fuck that guy's name is, and I didn't want to revisit this topic this week. But these leftists have left me no choice.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border.
Now, when I was in preschool, I learned a story called The Boy Who Cried Wolf. It's a very simple story that's meant for little children. But apparently this children's story is just way too complicated for NPC journalists. These journalists are absolutely obsessed with declaring that every single thing the Trump administration does is basically Nazism. Those migrant detention centers that were operating since Obama was president, guess what? Those are concentration camps. A temporary ban on people from certain Muslim countries entering the United States? Yep, that's the moral equivalent of the Holocaust. Jimmy Fallon had Donald Trump on his late night talk show. He might as well be wearing an SS uniform. Of course, every time these NPC journalists make this accusation, I believe them less and less. Their credibility is on a constant downward spiral. Maybe one day there will be actual Nazis running this country, but I won't care because I won't believe a word of the news coverage about it. If Donald Trump created an actual concentration camp and started exterminating the migrants, I wouldn't believe Business Insider, Vox Media, the New York Times, or any of these journalist platforms for calling him out on doing so. I would just assume they're lying, like they've been lying this entire time. Now, one of these propaganda outlets that's real determined to convince us that Trump is operating concentration camps is none other than Business Insider. And they've got a crack team of historians to explain that to us.
To understand what has historically been considered a concentration camp, we looked to the experts. Historians Andrea Pitzer and Jonathan Heislip have both written books on the matter.
There's only one problem here. Neither of these people are historians. Andrea Pitzer is actually a journalist. If you Google her name, her Twitter pops up, and if you read it, you'll realize she's nothing more than a left-wing activist. This is not someone who I would expect to get an uncolored, objective view of the news from. But it is someone who I would expect to receive an entirely partisan, unfair, one-sided view of a political issue from. Jonathan Heislip is also not a historian. He's a sociologist. You know, the academic discipline where only 2% of its faculty, according to a study, identify as conservative, while 83% identify as either liberal or radically left-leaning. Needless to say, I'm not going to trust anything a sociologist has to say on a political issue. As far as I'm concerned, they're less of an academic discipline and more of a left-wing political interest group. It's absolutely ridiculous that Business Insider would try and convince us that the migrant detention centers are concentration camps. Obviously, there is no genocide going on there. In fact, these camps are not death camps at all. Perhaps the most striking difference is, unlike the Nazi death camps, the migrants in the migrant detention centers are free to leave. If they want to go back to Central America or whatever other shithole country they came from, then good riddance. Immigrations and customs will happily send them on their way. Yet these people choose to remain in these migrant detention centers. Why would they do that? Well, they're going for a pipe dream. They're hoping their fraudulent asylum claim slips through the cracks and that they get permitted to stay in the United States. This is unlikely to happen because 80% of the migrants that cross over the US-Mexican border end up having their asylum claims denied for being fraudulent. These people aren't actually refugees. They're migrating for purely economic reasons. I don't feel that it's fair to refer to these people as refugees at all. Until they've applied for it and successfully been determined to be refugees, they're not refugees. Instead, I like to refer to them as criminals or people attempting to commit immigration fraud. And why do I refer to them as criminals? Well, it's a crime to lie under oath or to lie on immigration paperwork. That paperwork is signed under penalty of perjury. And we know these people aren't really refugees because of the rate at which they're denied. So I think illegal immigrant criminals is a much more accurate term to refer to these illegal migrants who cross our border. Now, am I a super big fan of these migrant detention centers? Absolutely not. I don't think we should have anyone locked up on the US-Mexican border, period, for something like this. But let's be honest here. It's not Trump's fault. Just like it's not Obama's fault when he was president and ran these same detention centers. The real problem is our liberal system of government. Whenever someone illegally immigrates into the United States, before the government is willing or able to deport them, it has to make sure that every single one of their multitude of individual rights has been followed and adhered to. This in turn requires the government to make certain findings to prove certain things, and it gives all of these illegal migrants procedural rights. So if the government doesn't do things exactly how they're supposed to do, then even if substantively they have no reason to be in the country, even if they're not refugees, the fact that the government failed to comply with some loophole might mean that they get to stay regardless. So these migrants aren't naive to come into our country and falsely claim refugee status. They're going for a Hail Mary. They may know that their claim is fraudulent, but there's a possibility that the government may make a mistake. And since all our government seems to care about is individual rights, a mistake means they get to stay regardless. Of course, the outcome of this is a massive number of people incarcerated in what are de facto prisons along the border. You know how we could make this system way better? All we would have to do is remove the liberalism, take away these refugees' rights. Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself, but that's horrible. What about the poor refugees? Don't you have any sympathy for these people? Not really. But to answer that question, we don't need to abolish refugees. We just need to take away people's rights to claim refugee status. Just because we don't give any person who crosses the border a right to claim refugee status doesn't mean our country can no longer have refugees. Our country could still choose to designate certain people as refugees and grant them entry into the country. There would be nothing that would stand in the way to prevent this. Allowing our government to determine who qualifies as a refugee without having to be overly concerned about anyone's supposed individual rights would be a much more humane way of dealing with this problem than incarcerating tens of thousands of people in camps. Only someone who was radically committed to liberalism as an ideology would think of the system that we currently have in the United States to deal with refugees as a good system. Allowing the government to determine who qualifies as a refugee and who doesn't without having to worry about individual rights of the refugees themselves would be a much faster and more pragmatic way of dealing with this problem. It would be far more preferable to detaining tens of thousands of people, detaining children, and in some situations, separating children from their parents. In fact, I think the migrants themselves would prefer a system like this. First of all, it would be much faster than the current system. Second of all, they could probably accurately predict whether or not their refugee claim would be accepted or not. This means that a lot of people who would never qualify as refugees could avoid making the dangerous trip across Mexico into the United States, only to end up deported back to where they started from. Despite this, I've heard no one seriously consider abandoning liberalism as a solution to this problem. I've seen no serious discussion of this being a possibility on any news program in the United States. I've also not read a single news article that proposed something like this. Everyone in the United States is just so ideologically committed to liberalism, it's like they have blinders on. The solution is so obvious and hiding in plain view, but nobody realizes it. But what are your thoughts? Do you think that refugees coming across the border really need these individual rights? Do you really think that the current status quo is a good system? Let me know in the comments if you do. I'd be happy to have a conversation about it if you want. Anyways, if you like this video and you're not subscribed to this channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks.